All right, I think Sarah, you ready to get started?
Yeah.
Sound good? Awesome. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining Sarah and I here today, and thank you so much to IHA for having us. We are here to talk about plain language. It's one of our favorite topics. Um, and we're going to start off just by introducing ourselves a little bit and then diving into sort of the purpose of our conversation today. So, thank you so much for making space to be here. If you haven't already introduced yourself in the chat, we'd love to know more about you. We see we've got folks from all over the place, and that's really awesome. I think that's one of the things we've really enjoyed about the virtual world is getting to connect with so many people doing important work all over the place. So, yeah, thank you so much for making time to be here with us today, and hopefully this is the beginning of more conversations in the future. Um, Sarah, I'll let you start off.
Great. Hi, everyone. Good morning or afternoon, wherever you're at. My name is Sarah Glazer. I'm the program manager for the Clear Language Lab. I came to this work after a little over 10 years teaching, a little bit in middle school, but mostly working with adult English language learners. And so I really am taking that lens when I'm talking about language and communication, thinking about all the awesome students I've worked with. And I have a master's in education with a focus on working with English language learners.
Awesome. And I am Melanie. I work with Sarah at the Clear Language Lab at Literacy Works. Um, my background is in adult education also. I've spent the last 20 years primarily working in the nonprofit sector in a variety of roles. I also have studied linguistics and plain language. And like Sarah said, a lot of my lens is also through the experience of working in adult education settings, providing support to students, lots of opportunities where students kind of came to me saying, I don't know what this letter means that I got from my HMO, or I need to figure out how to get to this appointment. Lots of work like that that I think really grounds the work we do now at the Clear Language Lab. So you'll probably, if not today, at some point hear us talking a lot about examples that lead back to those experiences. So yeah, that's a big reason why we do this work now is we saw the need for um, more energy being expended in communication and clear communication across different sectors and subsectors. Just to give you a tiny little bit about us, we are with the Clear Language Lab at Literacy Works. Sarah's going to share in the chat a link to a bunch of documents from us. Feel free to peruse those later on. But we are based in Chicago, but we work with folks all over the place. Um, we do all sorts of work with plain language training, coaching, editing. I did include in the link that Sarah's sharing oh, there it is. Some of the upcoming free events that we have going on related to plain language over the next month or two. So please feel free to check those out. Um, and really at the core of what we do is really trying to make everyday communications easier to navigate, understand, and use. And I think what really grounds us is coming back to this social justice lens of thinking about this work we do, why we do it, and how are we um, channeling our energies to change how systems work for people, and hopefully work better for people. So anyway, that's what we do. That's what grounds us, and what we'll keep coming back to in our conversation today. Um, and I think what connects it to our topic today is really thinking about the ways that plain language can be used in so many different ways, and that it's not just. I think a lot of times people have an idea of plain language being just like, I'm just going to swap out a few words. And I hope that our conversation today helps us think a little differently about that, if that's sort of maybe what we've been familiar with so far. A couple premises that I want to just talk through to make sure we're on the same page. We're not going to get too deep into these. We're going to kind of take them um, as parts of our work, and just so we're all on the same page of sort of where our values are. For us, it's really important to recognize that language is not neutral. I think a lot of times that's a safe place to want to live is like the neutral language, but I think we always have to recognize that we're always making choices about how we talk about people, how we talk to people, the vocabulary we use. So just trying to kind of shift that mindset that there's some magical neutral language out there. A lot of times we're, even thinking about the examples we choose to include, we're always making decisions, and just recognizing that that is part of what we do when we're communicating, and not to shy away from that. Um, we also really want to make sure that we're recognizing that our readers have various identities, and honor those and approach them with a lens of cultural humility and know that we don't know everything. We say that all the time. We're always learning too. And so just keeping that in mind. I think that's an area that I think sometimes um, we talk about a lot because we don't always, that part of the conversation, I think, with communication sometimes doesn't get brought up enough. So we want to make sure that that's very obvious that we want to center that. We also, in our work, it's really important to us that we're constantly coming back to the folks that are most impacted, and traditionally, historically, have also been harmed by some of these systems that we're working with, and really trying to work to raise up and center those voices. And I know that we all are coming at this from very different roles, and maybe have different opportunities in our organizations to make change, but that's kind of where we're always going to try to be going first when we're talking about um, what communication we want to accomplish. And last but not least, as I said, we make mistakes, and we try to learn from them. So I'm sure that can be really hard in professional spaces to admit you make mistakes. But I think it's vital to this work that we learn from things that don't work, or we learn from things that we wish we'd done differently. So just exploring that, even if it feels uncomfortable. I joke around, I'm a recovering perfectionist, so it could be really, really hard to talk about what went sideways in a situation. So take it, take go with that where you feel most comfortable, but just kind of putting that all out there. We'll have some different ways to engage today, so we'll be using a couple different tools. So please feel free to engage in whatever way makes sense for you, and we'll have lots of opportunity to follow, ask questions at the end, but also just follow up with us in general if you want to talk more about something or don't feel like you want to ask it in this space. So Sarah's going to talk a little bit about our goals today.
Yeah, so let's talk about why we're here, what we hope to learn from our time together today. So starting off, we're thinking about why do we use plain language? How does it benefit our various audiences? So hopefully by the time you leave today, you'll have an understanding of the benefits of plain language and how to think about using this lens with the different audiences that you communicate with. We're also going to have opportunity to look at some examples and compare and contrast text through a plain language lens, and really thinking about how we change things or how we might adapt materials or messages considering our audience, our purpose, and the format that we're sharing information. And finally, we want to think about some of the barriers that come up with communication. There's definitely challenges that can make it hard to communicate in the ways that we might want to. So we'll talk about some of those barriers and brainstorm some solutions or some ways we can address those barriers.
Awesome. So, to get us started, we just kind of want to check in where everybody's at. So we have a very brief little quiz, not quiz, not a quiz, brief little check-in about sort of where we're starting at with plain language personally and institutionally, and then thinking about what some barriers might be. Why are we here? Because there are lots of ways that you could spend an hour and a half of your time on a work day. Like, what's coming up for you that you said, I want to talk about this, I want to go to that session. We're going to share in the chat a link to the Menti tool, and you're going to have a couple questions. So you can either go to the Menti website and type on the code on the screen, or Sarah's going to also put the link in the chat. So the code is there, 7508 or 089961. Or if you have a phone handy and you want to click the QR code, you could do that too. So just take a moment or two and get yourself there. And I'm going to share the screen with that on it so we can all be together there. Okay, let's see. Sarah, is my Mentimeter screen showing up? Oh,
Not yet.
yeah. Okay.
So for folks, if there's some reason that you can't access it, I see some people have like a security block. Feel free. Well, the questions are on the screen, so you can drop your answers in the chat as well if that's easier for you.
We'll wait just a second and see what people have to say. Like we got a good chunk of folks that have chimed in. So it seems like we're trending toward we have a pretty good understanding of plain language. We marked ourselves maybe a little lower on maybe being able to go between these different audiences, and generally feel pretty good about our organizations. Okay, so I'm curious about our next question then. What are the challenges that are getting in the way, or again, what kind of sparked you to come here? If if you feel like things are pretty good, what's the gap that you're trying to kind of reach? So the second question here is just asking what gets in the way of clear and effective communication at your organization. We want to make sure we're talking about things today that are relevant and fit in with what is going on for you. So take a minute or two and feel free to add your thoughts, or if you want to share, ping Sarah directly, Sarah can throw it in there if that's more comfortable for you. But yeah, we'll take just a minute or two so we can really think about why are you here? What brings you here? Awesome. All right, let's see what we've got so far. Sarah, can you see that screen now? I just want to make sure it's switching.
Yeah, I can see the responses that
Okay,
people
great.
are putting in.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for chiming in. I'm just gonna look at a couple of them. They're all really important and valuable. Oh, we got more. Great. Oh, this is great. See lots of things that I think will continue to kind of come up. Silos, yes, yes, yes. That is such a big one. Even in the same organization, we might feel like we have all these different departments that don't talk to each other or don't talk to each other enough. Yeah, just the overall complexity of content that might be being pushed out. Yeah, the dance. And I think that's a big part of what we're talking about today is that dance between how much do we how much do we adjust for these different audiences that we might be talking to. And then I see another point of just, oh, people just don't get it yet. Like they don't, I think a big challenge is that you go through years and years of school sometimes to get into some of these roles, and along the way, you don't really do a lot of practice writing to different audiences. You're mostly writing to other academics. You're writing to your professor. You're writing to your boss. You're not writing in lots of different ways that is more reflective of real life communication. And I think that's a big challenge that we have in our educational system for sure that kind of doesn't prepare people for this switch that happens when it's like, wait a minute, you're not just sitting around talking to a bunch of other like nerds about the same topic that you're interested in. You've got to explain this idea, in a totally different way. And, I think a lot of people just aren't ready for that. I see time mentioned a couple of places. Yeah, I think that's a challenging one because in the long run, I think there can be a lot of time you get back if we can communicate clearly and effectively, but that front end effort and energy and time can be a lot to find and make happen. Yeah, and then just balancing, if you're not a subject matter expert, it can take a lot to unpack that from subject matter experts. I see that too. Sarah and I are in that position a lot where we're helping people write things that aren't our area of expertise. But in some ways, it's a superpower because I think we ask questions that people have. And I think that ends up being a really great advantage. But it's, again, takes time and it takes this unsiloing that all of you are mentioning here. Let me just see if there's anything else that. Awesome. These are great. Thank you everybody for chiming in. This is really helpful to think about these nuances that you're all grappling with. If there's anything else that anyone wants to share about the challenges you face or, what kind of resources you're looking for at any point, please feel free to share that with us, or afterwards. You can definitely reach out. All right, I just want to make sure I'm back to the plain language. What is it? Why does it matter screen? Is that
Yep.
right? Okay,
Yeah,
great.
we can see the slides.
I am always paranoid about switching screens, as you could tell. Awesome. Okay, let's dive in then. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we might define plain language. And yeah, like what do we mean when we say that? Because if it's actually like a phrase that doesn't even like sound like what it is, which is very hilarious, and the irony is not lost on me. So I think, Sarah, were you gonna chime in here?
Yeah. So the definition we like to share for plain language is a communication is in plain language if its wording, structure, and design are so clear that the intended readers can easily find what they need, understand what they find, and use that information. That is a very long sentence, and there's a lot of pieces, a lot to unpack there. But we have the words intended readers bold because that's really at the crux of what plain language is about. If I am not the intended audience, it doesn't really matter if it works for me, right? We're really thinking about creating communications, documents, messages that are usable, understandable, for our intended audience, and that they can find the information that they need to accomplish their goals, whatever those might be. And when we think about how to do that, we're not just thinking about the language we're using, the words, we're also thinking about the structure of the information, how it's organized, and the overall design and experience of the materials that we're sharing. We can go to the next one. And so plain language is a lens. It's a way to think about how we're communicating, and it can really be applied to all different types of communications, all audiences, and there isn't a one size fits all answer, right? Because it is supposed to be for our specific audience, and so what works for one group of people might not work for a different group of people. So what you're not going to get today is a one and done checklist of how to do plain language, because that's not really how it works. It really is context dependent on what information you're sharing and who you're sharing it with. So some people find, kind of hear about plain language and think that it isn't for everybody, that it's kind of a way to oversimplify or kind of really strip down information to serve certain groups of people. And one of the studies that we like to share, I think this is a really cool example of how powerful plain language is for everybody. This group did a study where they had two different websites. One was the original website. It was kind of not great. And the other was revamped using plain language and design principles. And they had people complete a task they give them a task to complete using this website. And They looked at things like how long it took them to complete the task, how well they completed it, and then how much they liked using the website. And what they found is, regardless of people's literacy levels, regardless of people's education backgrounds, kind of all of those factors, everybody preferred the plain language website. They were able to complete their task more quickly. They were able to complete it more accurately, so there were less errors in navigating the website, and people just liked it more, right? They were just happier with their experience. And so I think this is such a cool example that illustrates that plain language really does, that everybody benefits from applying a plain language lens to your communication.
And I mean, I think if I ask in the chat and I say, can anyone maybe put an exclamation point in the chat if you have encountered a situation in the last month where you didn't understand something that someone was trying to tell you. Either it doesn't have to be at work, it could be at the doctor's office, it could be at the store. But I have a feeling, oh look, I see the chat popping up, lots of exclamation points. That right, we're not just thinking about one like audience where we have to like adjust. We're really wanting to be thinking about that we're being flexible and adjusting all the time, because it's really, how does that feel? How did that experience feel when that communication didn't happen, or that communication was not as effective as it could have been? I'm guessing some of the adjectives we might see in the chat might be frustrated, or you know, annoyed, or unhappy, mad, upset. A lot of feelings of feeling like I can't understand, and also I'm not being like, the message isn't being like gotten to me correctly, or gotten to me in a way that makes sense for me. So this can have a ripple effect, because then what happens is maybe we don't trust that system as much next time, or we don't follow through because we figure it doesn't matter. What's the ripple effect when these kind of communication hiccups happen, and how can we avoid them? So yeah, this is unfortunately a part of life. I know I sometimes have trouble communicating when I get home from work, after I leave my office, and sometimes I communicate with my partner, and he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I joke that I used up all of my clear communication at work. So it's common. We all have challenges with this. So yeah, everyone can also though benefit when we really prioritize this in our everyday, whether that's work or personal life. We often talk about the idea of accessibility and universal design. And I don't know if everyone's familiar with this term, so I just wanted to share it. But I think in our work, we think of accessibility a little bit wider, than just someone asks for something, or there's a change someone needs that they require and we do it. Yes, those are important things. We want to make sure we're following the law and we're giving people the support they need, but we don't have to just do the minimum. We can do more. And so I think the idea of universal design kind of sums that up nicely. And it came out of the architecture world, but it's just this idea that the design and composition of an environment, so that it can be accessed, understood, and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of age, size, ability, or disability. So I think we really see plain language is mirroring and being very much in the same family as universal design in this idea. And some examples of this in the world are scissors that can work for left-handed or right-handed people, door handles that can be opened with someone's hand or their elbow, and you don't necessarily have to have fine motor skills, ramps and curb cuts that make it so people can avoid steps. There might be lots of reasons why people want to avoid steps, so we don't have to say, oh, are you a person that needs to avoid steps? We can just set it up so that that system is in place, so that people don't always have to ask for these accommodations. And I think that that's how we think of plain language as well, is we're trying to make the information as accessible as possible, for as many people as possible while balancing the specificity of the primary audience. So that's our dance always, of thinking about what are things that we can like incorporate that are going to generally be helpful, but also what is it that my specific audience, that's my priority audience, needs too. So for example, we might do things like think about our fonts and make sure that we're using the most, a good size font consistently, and we're not using tiny print and trying to save paper and making everything small and hard to read. Are we making sure we've got the right level of background information for our audience and making sure we're giving them enough so that they're not confused? When possible, how are we taking a trauma informed approach? And if this term is new, um, thinking about, how are we being mindful of what other people have experienced without having to get all their into all their business. We don't need to know what someone's been through to know that we might want to value transparency and making people feel comfortable and making sure people have choices, because that's basically kind of some of the core ideas there. We don't have to have people take a quiz to find that out. We can just say that's a good approach to take with everyone. Yeah, we just bring this up because we want to give you a little bit of like perspective of the kind of the philosophy, I guess you could say, the behind the scenes of like why it's important to do this. I think it's also important. A lot of you mentioned in those examples lack of buy-in or needing to be able to explain this to other people. So I think that can be something too you're thinking about, is like what sort of case can I make for people to help them understand why this is valuable in our work and valuable for our participants? So is it that we talk a lot about equity, but this doesn't, the way we might do things doesn't feel like it aligns with that? Is it that we prioritize accessibility? Okay, then how are we prioritizing it in our communications? And maybe really drawing some of those connections that people might not obviously see. Um, I will give you an example from my regular life where I had this epiphany years ago when I was teaching and overseeing a program. We students would have to take these kind of, they look like Scantron tests, but they were actually graded with like an overlay. So I had a student who I knew had some vision issues, and um, I enlarged the document because I thought, oh, this will be really helpful. Like this will be great. She'll be able to read this with more ease. And how great is that? I give her the paper, and lo and behold, she's like, "Well, why is mine different than everyone else's?" And in that moment, I had this thought of realizing, "Oh my gosh, I didn't check with her if that's what she wanted." Also, there's other people that might have vision issues that might have wanted this, but I didn't know that. Also, maybe someone's just tired that day, or they're hungry, or their hand hurts, and it would be helpful to have a bigger piece of paper to look at. So I realized, oh my gosh, I need to not make this an exception, I need to make this the rule. And so I went and from that day forward made all of them bigger and realized that, like, hey, we don't need to single anybody out in this case, and everybody might get what they need, and we don't know people's experiences on a given day and why that might be helpful for them. We just know we can make it available and make it easier. So that was a real like shift for me of recognizing that like we can just try to make these choices and these options as helpful as possible. So thinking about language, it's the same idea of like how are we thinking through the things we're communicating? I think a challenge that comes up a lot that we see is sort of the trickle down of like, oh, this stuff is really hard and it came down from some lawyer or some government agency, and then we're just going to copy and paste it because that is maybe all we can handle, and then it's going to get copy and pasted again, and pretty soon it's basically being put into things that it wasn't meant for in its original form. And there are certainly some government agencies that definitely we see a lot of challenges with that sort of habit. So yeah, these are some things that though I think it's important to think about and how this ties into your experiences and in your work of thinking about accessibility and widening the welcome for people. Okay. To sort of sum that up, we're all humans. Our community members, our colleagues, our partners, we are all humans. I have definitely had experiences where I'm talking to someone about something and realize we're talking about the same word, but not the same idea. So recognizing that like we all like are just people and trying to make sure that we're remembering that in our day to day. And recognizing that we all might have some form of temporary or permanent disability at some point in our lives, and we might not necessarily know what someone else is dealing with or going through or experiencing, and how that might be shifting. And thinking about just accessibility benefiting everyone. Again, we don't know everybody's business. We don't need to know everybody's business. We can just work to make accessibility the norm. And we see plain language as very tied to that. Oops, it says, I thought that was a clear thing. I did not delete it. Sorry about that. Any thoughts, comments, questions, feelings so far about anything that we're talking about? How do you see these things sort of showing up for you? Or how do you see these things being, um, you know, what other things, barriers are coming up that keep these things from happening if we think that they're valuable, if they're important, um, in your work? Anybody want to share? No pressure, but if anyone has any thoughts, feelings, I know we have a lot of knowledge in this room, so um, please feel free if anyone wants to chime in of how you see these ideas of accessibility and communication tied together.
One thing you said that really struck me is that if you're not the intended audience, it doesn't really matter if it works for you. And that's something I've definitely run into with stakeholders where I work when I'm sharing something with them for review. And it's hard for them to leave their own perspective. And so I'm wondering if you have any advice on how to foster that kind of understanding with stakeholders so they can provide a helpful review.
Yeah.
I think,
Oh, go ahead.
Sarah, no, you go.
Yeah, I think that that's like so real and really hard to help people kind of shift that perspective. I think some of the things that we've found that help in conversation with different groups that we work with is really asking those questions that people have, right? That people that come up from either as us when we're not subject matter experts, or the questions we have, or things that we know people in the community bring up, kind of like presenting those questions and asking people to think about them, because I think that can be and help bring people to that aha moment, is like, oh, that is an important question that people have, and it's not, we need to make sure we address it. We also are in a position where we're really lucky. We have an awesome community group that we work with, that we get feedback on a lot of the projects that we work with. And so we're able to take their feedback and bring it to the organizations that we're working with and say, this is what actual people out in the world had to say about this communication. And that's been invaluable in that relationship, and kind of helping people see that other perspective. And Melanie, please add anything else that you want to share.
No, I'm really glad you asked. That was Kara, right? I think in just 2 slides, we're going to get to something that I think answers a little bit of that question that you have. Oh, this is a great point too in the chat. Yeah, that even like people are busy. I think this is such a great point, that people are very busy and it can be overwhelming, even if you are a staff person, to read and ingest some of this information. That's such a great point. Yeah, I think that both of your questions, I think, tie into something Sarah's going to talk about in just a second. So we will come right back to it, but I'm really glad that we're bringing up these ideas and talking about them. Does anybody else have anything they want to add before we move on? This is great. I'm really loving these questions. Okay. So I just wanted to start with an example, and then Sarah's going to dive into some common areas where I think we see if something is off in one of those, we're going to end up with something that doesn't maybe meet our needs. But this is just one example of thinking about, okay, let's say we're going to have a health fair. We might be emailing our supervisor about the event and the budget. Maybe our colleagues on our team, we're talking about logistics and we're having meetings and we're talking about action items. But maybe colleagues within our organization that aren't on our team, we're telling them different things, right? Because we have to remember they're not going to necessarily know all the stuff we know. Or we might not be clear, they might not be clear on how they can be a part of that thing or benefit from that thing. Community partners, maybe we're sending them emails and flyers and social media and ways to show them how this event will benefit them or their partners. And then maybe community members, we're talking about straight up like invites to this event and things like that. And it might be print, it might be social media, it might be videos, all sorts of things. So just trying to kind of get this idea across that like we're kind of always doing this dance of like communicating about different things, different mediums with different people, and recognizing that like all of these things should probably look different that we're sending to. Now, that doesn't mean we're starting from scratch, but we're constantly having to sort of kind of move and do a little bit of a dance to hit the right notes and get people the right people what the right things are that they need for that thing. So Sarah's going to talk about some questions that we often come back to that if these are off, we often find that that's a good starting point to have some of these conversations that you all are mentioning. We love an acronym, so.
Love an acronym. This is our crafty acronym. I think it's super, super helpful. Like Melanie said, if something's not working, not landing the way you wanted it to, not having the effect you want, or if you're just starting off, right, and you're beginning this writing process, this is something that can be a really great tool to help ground that you're thinking. And so the order in which you think about these things doesn't necessarily have to be in this order, but like we said, the acronym is helpful for remembering it. So we have our circumstances is really thinking about what is the context of this information. So what kind of information is this? But also thinking about like the processes around this sharing this information. How are people going to come in contact with it? What might they be experiencing when they are like looking for or seeking out this information? So I think this is one place where like thinking about trauma-informed design is really relevant. Like, am I working with people who might be experiencing a stressful event? That's going to impact how I'm communicating with them versus if I'm sharing something that's just like a happy-go-lucky communication, right? Like that impacts the messaging and the tone that we're sharing with people. Relationship is thinking about both me as an individual and also my organization. What relationship do I have with my audience? If I'm working with someone one-on-one who I have a strong relationship with, that communication is going to look different than if I'm talking to a complete stranger. Is there already trust? Does the community I'm talking to see my organization as a trustworthy source? Sometimes they don't, and we have to think about how to build trust and repair relationships with the people we're talking to. I think that especially coming from healthcare settings, like people have a lot of mixed feelings about hospitals and clinics and the medical field, right? So you might have to be doing some of that restorative work in the way that you're communicating and building relationships with people. Audience is thinking about who am I talking to? What are their needs? What knowledge do they already have about this topic? And really trying to get a focus on why are they looking for this information, or why do they need this information? And when we have a clear answer to that question, then we can give them what they need, right? But we need to understand what they're looking for and what they need to make sense of it. Format is just thinking about how we're sharing the information. So is it a flyer? Is it an email? Is it a handbook? Is it a postcard, right? Whatever type of information you're sharing, because obviously the format affects how we communicate, how people interact with things. And then finally, thinking about the topic and the purpose is, is it clear what information I'm trying to share and why am I sharing it, right? What action do I want people to take with this information? What do I want them to do? And if we have a clear outcome for sharing this communication, if we have a clear action we want people to take, then we can communicate that and they're more likely to do it. But if we're not clear on our purpose, then we're not going to create as clear of communications. So using these questions, using this framework can really help us kind of iron out some of the hiccups that come up with communication and potentially identify why things aren't working the way that we want them to. And Kara, your question is right. You can think about bringing these questions to the group that you're working with and asking them to kind of try and think about this perspective in when they're reviewing those documents.
Yeah, I think so much can be answered by kind of starting this with the basics here or coming back to this. And I think several of you mentioned the challenge of, oh, we have so many cooks in the kitchen sometimes that sometimes I think we don't even know what our purpose is. We sometimes stop at the topic, but we never actually make it to figuring out the purpose. I know I was helping a group once with a postcard around COVID vaccines, and we started kind of snowballing as you do when you're brainstorming, which can be great. But all of a sudden we're like, well, how much stuff are we trying to fit on this postcard? And we took a step back and realized, wait a minute, our audience are people that want to get vaccinated, but just don't know how. That's our audience that we were speaking to for that particular thing. When we iterated that, it made us so much sense that when we came back to the content, we could say, well, we don't need X, Y, and Z because that's for a different group. And we're talking to the folks that are just trying to get a quick way to get vaccinated. And it was super helpful to kind of have those things to come back to say, if this doesn't line up, we either need to change this purpose and audience, or we need to change the message and the content because those don't go together right now. And I think that's really common to see having a topic, but not a purpose. So, right, the topic might be, you know, uh, breast cancer awareness. That's the topic, but what are we trying to do? Are we trying to get people in a certain zip code to go get a mammogram? Are we trying to increase visits to the clinic? Are we trying to lower certain cancer rates? If we don't have that clear purpose, it ends up oftentimes being kind of jumbly, or we have too many things going on and people get overwhelmed. And I think the same thing applies to that example in the chat about our coworkers. The same thing. We don't want to overwhelm them either, especially as much as we might be deep diving in our job every day, they might not be, up to speed on the same stuff we are because their job might have a different lens or a different purpose. So we might have to be filling in more background information, even with our colleagues sometimes than we realize. If you've ever had that experience where someone's talking to you about a TV show that you've never seen and you're sort of like, I don't know what they're talking about. Like, I have an idea, but I don't really know. I think that that's a position sometimes people end up in a lot. So we're going to look at just a really short example because I want to just look at how even something that's an everyday thing could be improved or thought through with this lens. I'm going to assume that we have some ideas here about why communicating with our colleagues is important, but if there's anything we haven't talked about already that you want to add in the chat that you're really want to make sure people are thinking about, please feel free to add that. Or if you want to unmute and just talk about your own experiences of why you think this is such an important thing to think about internal communication, please feel free to chime in. Feel free to think about it. We can come back to this. Oh, I see something in the chat. Yes, that's a great point. Is sometimes we need things. And if we don't communicate clearly and effectively, we might not get the things we need. Um, yeah, we all are on the same team, hopefully. That's such a great point. And we want to be working toward the same vision, but we might not be if we're assuming things that we're not all clear about what we're doing. Um, yeah, limit mistakes. Like everybody's really busy. So if we can figure out ways to avoid having to look at something 10 times or have a miscommunication that causes a challenge, why wouldn't we want to do that? Exactly. Um, yes, like I said, I've worked at nonprofits my whole adult life, and it's very hard. The siloing, it is very real. Um, I know I was very frustrated recently where I needed to make an appointment with a specialist and I could only call and leave a message. And then when I called back my doctor, they're like, "Yeah, that's all you could do." And I was like, I couldn't believe how siloed the departments were in this big organization. But that's the reality that we're dealing with. So how can we avoid those things? Um, so here's just a very brief example. I'm going to read this if you're just listening. Maybe you're doing 10 things right now. It's a very short example of an email, but I just want you to think about this leads to the comment that was just in the chat. What are some things that we might think about to get more about what we need from an interaction with a coworker and make it easier for them too, so that they're not having to dig through and figuring out what is it that you want from me. So here's a sample email. It says, the subject is diabetes info session. It says, "Hi, Carla. Just following up about the diabetes education section next week. Attached is an outline of what we will cover. Can you look it over and tell me what you think if you have time? Let me know when you want to talk about the breast cancer education sessions coming up next month too." It says, "Thanks, Florence." So not that unlike an email that I think people get all the time. What might be some things you might suggest to Florence that could make this a little more helpful? Because let's say Florence is like, "Oh, Carla did not send me what I needed this Friday, and I'm like needed her feedback, and I'm frustrated now." But we also know that there are some things that maybe Florence could do differently to get what she needs. I see line breaks. Yeah, even though it's not that long, it's still a good amount of text that we have to kind of scan through and figure out what is in there. I'm just looking through the chat now. Yeah, skimming. A lot of people skim emails. Yes, we're trying to look to see, what do I need to do? When do I need to do it by? Should this be a priority right now, or do I need to go on to do something else? How can we make it as easy as possible for that other person? Yes, and respect that their time is valuable too. I love that, Rose. That's such a great point. I think that's a great way to think about plain language. Is it's a sign of respect to say, "Hey, I want to make sure you get what you need, so we make sure I get what I need, and we're all just trying to support each other in this way that might not seem so um like that's what that is." But I think that really is a great way to put that. Yeah, I think all these are fantastic suggestions. I think a couple of these questions that come up for me, like, what's the purpose of this email? What exactly does Florence want Carla to do? I don't know how obvious it is. It's pretty open-ended. So what are some of these suggestions? You all just gave a bunch. Um, yeah, that's a great point, Michelle. Maybe if it's a short enough thing, can you just put it in the email so they don't have to open an attachment? Yeah, split the message. I love it. These are fantastic, fantastic suggestions. I love that, Amy. Put the date in there. Oh my gosh, it's like I think you're all reading my mind. So here's an example. We could do this lots of different ways. There in no way is this the only way you could do it. I always like to stress that there's not one right way to do things. But playing around with this, maybe Carla or Florence could say something like, "Hey, Carla, I'm following up about this session we're co-facilitating next week. Can you review the attached outline by the end of the day Friday? here are the things I would love the feedback on, and gave some specific questions. A lot of things that you all just said are here. We've got the date added, we've got some bullet points. We took out the stuff about the breast cancer meeting. That can maybe be a different email, so we're not overwhelming um, Carla with 2 different topics that maybe have different priorities for her. We got a little deeper into the specificity so that, I think a lot of times if we're not specific, people just might write back and say, it's fine. And maybe it is fine, but also if there is something specific, why not just tell them? Awesome. All the comments you all just made are fantastic. And I think yeah, now we're kind of working from both. We're working for both people. Hopefully Florence is going to get what she needs and won't be so stressed out. Carla sees exactly what Florence needs, and it's not such a big deal to do because she knows when she needs to do it and what she needs to do, and it's very, very clear. So something like this, is a short little email that we're adding these ideas into. But we can do the same thing if we're thinking about something bigger, like a manual or a slide deck. Like, how are we thinking about what that other person needs? I think one thing we see a lot are handbooks, and handbooks can be so dense and so overwhelming. And oftentimes it's not even clear what you're supposed to do, even if you can find the place in the handbook. So thinking through this lens of like, why don't we treat all things like this? Anything that we're making and writing, can we think through about how we can break it down further, how we can be more specific, how we can be responsive to what that audience person, whoever that person is, needs. Even if it's something as every day as an email, it doesn't have to always be just the big things we're thinking of, like the big marketing thing or the big, annual report. It could just be as simple as, making sure our emails are clear. And maybe if Florence doesn't know how to do this, maybe that's something we can write back with and say, hey, Florence, I just want to check when you need this by, and if there's anything specific you want me to look for. Just if, we're trying to also think about how do we help our colleagues do some of these things in ways that are supportive and helpful, and maybe model for them the things that maybe they're not doing yet, but we hope that they will start doing if we don't have that opportunity to sort of have explicit conversations about it, or it's awkward. Sometimes it's not always easy to give that kind of feedback. So awesome. Thank you everyone for the fantastic feedback. So the same kind of question, but now thinking about like community partners we may be working with. Sarah's gonna talk a little bit about that. But if anyone has any thoughts you want to throw into the chat, think about that.
Yeah, so thinking about kind of extending the question beyond our colleagues to other organizations, people outside of our direct workspace. Why does clear communication matter with community partners? I'll give people a minute to write. I think as folks are thinking about this, I think a lot of the answers are going to be the same, right? We want to respect people's time. We want our message to get across clearly. We want to make sure that, they can amplify our message and goals, but need clarity to get it right and be effective, right? We can't always expect people to kind of speak on our behalf. We have to give them something to work with. It helps build trust. Yeah. Clear, transparent communication is really important for trusting relationships. Awesome. So we're going to look at, great, thank you, Melanie. So here we have a picture. It's a screenshot of a flyer for an event. So this is an event flyer. It says 5th Annual Health and Wellness Fair, healthcare for you and your whole family. And then there's information about the details, the date, the time, the address. It explains that there's some free activities. It says chair yoga, massages, Zumba classes, so some activities like that, and then has a website and a QR code at the bottom. And so we're thinking about this as this is a flyer that was made for an event. And we have a scenario here. So Jessie emails a contact at a local community center to share this flyer to post about an upcoming event. She later sees that the organization shared the poster on social media. Jessie had expected them to print it. So right off the bat, right, we're seeing that she had intended for this to be printed out and it was shared a different way. And so one question that's not on the slide, but if people want to think about why could that be a problem, right? Why is that potentially an issue if something that's designed to be a printed out is shared on social media? And then what could Jessie do next time to make sharing information like this more effective? I'll give folks a chance to think and respond. I feel like if it's easier for folks to come off mute, we can probably have a few people do that too. Right, it's a lot of text for a social media post. Ooh, they are coming in hot. Okay. Yeah, so there's different sizes. So if something's meant to be printed out and be larger, once it gets shrunk down to the fit on Instagram or Facebook or other social media, the font's going to be really tiny and it's going to be really hard to read, especially on a phone, which is how most people interact with social media. We also run into the issue of if this is shared as an image, it's not going to be accessible to someone who's using a screen reader or an assistive device to navigate the information. So they're not going to be able to access the content. And what could Jessie do next time? I see things like, an issue, it may not reach the intended audience if it's shared on social media. Totally. Let's see here. I see a suggestion, right, about like asking the organization what their preference is and sharing the information that way. Yeah, that's a fantastic idea. Right, so thinking about asking people, kind of telling people what to put in a social media post, giving that the content for a caption or the description that would go along with the image. I think I saw something about like kind of labeling it, the file and the email, so people know it's supposed to be a poster, or asking them to print it out. Printing may be cost prohibitive, so printing it and delivering it for them. Yeah, awesome. These are some fantastic ideas. Melanie, if I'm missing anything, they were coming in really fast. Great. Yeah. So provide a social media image specifically, right? So some of the ideas we had, and I think you all captured a lot of this, right? Can she print it out and deliver it to be hung up? Maybe people didn't print it because it was in color. So can she provide a black and white version so it's easier for organizations to print out? People suggested, right, giving really explicit instructions of how she would like it to be shared. Sharing two versions, right? Sharing a social media version, a picture, and including that blurb that she wants included. And I think that part is really important. I was recently working with an organization and they were talking about they had volunteer positions and they would they're free legal assistance, and so they would contact law firms and see if lawyers wanted to volunteer to work with their program. And they were telling me how they would send out this call for volunteers, and they would get all these people who did not understand what they were volunteering for, didn't quite understand the types of cases they were working with and things like that. And that's because people were kind of changing the message. It was going through this game of telephone. They would take the original email that was sent, and then it would be too much text for them to put in their like internal newsletter. So then they would shorten it and change it or tweak some of the details. And so by the time it got to the potential volunteers, the message had changed. So we want to make sure that we're kind of giving organizations we're working with all the information that they need to promote our content, and being clear about what we don't want changed and saying, hey, this is the message we want sent out. If it's too many words, if it's not clear enough, let us know and we can adjust it. But if you don't want something to be tweaked or changed, right, communicating that to make sure that your message, it stays the same as it's shared out with beyond your organization.
Yeah, this is a really common thing that I think we see a lot, is just that I love that you called it telephone, Sarah. That's exactly what it's sort of like. It's like it just keeps changing a little bit until it's like different enough that, yeah, and then they're getting volunteers that don't fit, that aren't a good fit because they're not signing up for the thing they thought they were. So being, yeah, really explicit and dividing and conquering these things in the right way. Awesome. Thank you. All right, I think we know why it matters with our community members. As we talked about from the beginning, oftentimes our communities that we might be working with might have historically not always, engaged with our systems or trusted our systems. And we wanna try to make that better, obviously, and just help people get what they need. This is looking a little bit more at that design part that people talked about. So we have two examples of similar information here, but I just want to kind of get your thoughts about what do you notice that might be different between these two. So the one on the left, we sort of have a light blue background with some general graphics. And then the one on the right, we've kind of got we've got an image and we've got a couple different blocks with different types of information in it. What pops out at you between the one on the left and the one on the right in terms of anything? What do you notice and what do you see as being either more or less helpful for our audience? We might like things in either one. That is totally fine. We're not trying to say something's all good or all bad. We're really just kind of looking for what works. I see some notes. We've got the details labeled on the right. Yeah, we've got the who, what, where, when, why, making it a little more relatable. Yeah, okay, we've got some fans of the one on the left. Yeah, we could maybe declutter both of them a little bit more. I agree. I think yeah, these are fantastic points. I love it. And this often happens in our community voices group, where we'll have a couple different examples and people will say, well, I like this about this one, but I like that about that one. And then we'll take that and really absorb it and try to kind of combine them together. Yeah, the image of a person might make a difference. So having a picture there. So yeah, we've kind of got some things in both of these that might be appealing, that we might want to change. So it sounds like we like some of the simplicity of the first one, but we like the grouping of the second one. So that might be something we can come back to and figure out, how do we kind of combine those elements. Yeah, that's such a great point in the chat about choosing pictures and being thoughtful about pictures, that this picture purposely isn't scary. We've got a smiling person who's like, this is no big deal, because that's a very scary thing for a lot of people. But all of these points you're all bringing up are fantastic, is really figuring out like, what are the parts that are working and then what are the parts we can change. If you haven't ever glanced at this book, it's I talk about it a lot just because I don't come from a design background, but I knew that doing this work, I had to understand some stuff better than I did coming into it. And so a book that I read when I started doing this work that was really helpful is called The Non-Designer's Design Handbook by Robin Williams. I never will forget that because it is a different Robin Williams than the famous actor. But it really kind of talks through some of the elements that can help the basic design. I'm not talking about like we're doing all the fancy stuff in Photoshop or whatever. I'm just talking about, even in a Word document, some things that you can consider to make things easier to scan or skim. So I noticed a couple of people pointed out that they liked that the who, what, where, when, why was pulled out. I think the reason we gravitate toward things like that is then it makes it a little easier for us to skim. because maybe I know what it is. I just need to know the when, and I can see easily where that is. So her book talks a lot about using things like contrast, some repetitive elements, alignment, and grouping. So thinking about how we put things together is, I think, a really important part of the process. So yeah, I want to make sure we don't neglect the part of how things look, even though that might not be our job, and we might say, I don't know anything about formatting and design. There are some things, some fundamental things that we can pick up. We actually recently started a digital drop-in once a month because we recognized that this was a challenge and that people needed more support in this area. So once a month we have like a block where Sarah chats with people about stuff like this, of like, hey, how can I don't know what to do to make my headings stand out on these Word documents and make my reports easier to understand. So if you ever want just someone to brainstorm with, we have those going on every month now. So definitely keep that in the back of your mind if you're just looking for someone to ping ideas off of. We're happy to ping with you. I think the next one is on October 12th. Does that sound right, Sarah?
October 10th, I think. It's the second Tuesday of each month.
Awesome. So thinking about barriers and solutions, oops, I thought that was going away. I want to we'll talk just briefly about some common challenges, and then we want to give you a chance to kind of throw in some solutions. Like, what is stuff you're doing? I'm sure there's things here where you've kind of got some of these things already handled. What can you share with other folks that can help them? Because again, we've got lots of people here. I know there's a ton of knowledge in this virtual room that we can share. But we are going to just briefly recap some of these things. So Sarah, I think, was going to talk about just revisiting this one more time.
Yeah, so like we talked a little bit at the beginning about this crafty acronym. And something that, is, we kind of touched on this already, but when things aren't working, this is a great starting place to kind of evaluate maybe why it's not working. So you can see we have this flyer on the left, says back to school health fair. There's a lot happening, a lot of text, a lot of different fonts and colors and images. And it's not really clear who the audience is of this, what's the purpose of the flyer, and what we're supposed to do with it, right? And so I think using these questions to kind of think about, is the information we want to share really clear to our audience? And if it's not, then we can make changes and adjustments to make it a better fit for our audience.
Another thing that comes up so much, and I think we've all alluded to this, I've seen the references to it in the chat, but maybe this term hasn't come up yet. But it's something we talk about a whole lot, is a cognitive bias called the curse of knowledge. And if you haven't ever heard that term before, we've got some resources in the resource list that is in the link that we have shared that we'll share again. There's a really lovely accessible book called, I think it's called Make It Stick. Made to Stick. I should remember it. Made to Stick by the Dan and Chip Heath, who are both like nerdy researchers, and they talk a lot about this idea. But it's that idea that once we know something really well, it can actually sometimes hinder how we communicate about it. So maybe you are really good at baking and you're helping someone make some muffins, and you skip some steps because they're so obvious to you. Or maybe I know growing up, my dad would try to teach me car things. He was a mechanic, and I would just like say, no, thank you. I'm going to go read a book, because he would always skip steps and then be like, why didn't you do the thing? And I'm like, because I didn't know. That's the curse of knowledge. So it's really easy in our jobs to get caught up in this, because we do our jobs and care about our jobs and spend lots of time doing our jobs. And we might not recognize that the person down the hall doesn't do the same job as us, or just have that same lens. I know that I remember when a colleague started a few years ago, and I gave them an alphabet soup of acronyms, and they just looked at me like, what are you talking about? So I ended up doing a whole drawing on like our whiteboard, because I was like, oh wow, I can't just throw these letters at you and expect you to know what they mean. This happened to me this week. I had gone for a test, and the person's test for related to pulmonology, and the person, I walked in and they said, "Are you here for the PFT?" And I don't know if you can imagine, but I sort of looked at them and I paused and I said, maybe, because I just knew I was there for a breathing test. But I wasn't in the brain space to unpack that they meant pulmonary function test. I just knew I was there for a breathing test. And so that's just another of a million examples that we've all probably experienced where that has happened. So really being mindful that we're explaining things in the situations where they need to be explained, and we're not assuming that people have the same background knowledge as us all the time.
Like a lot of you shared at the beginning, a big challenge is time and resources, right? Making sure that many of us wear a lot of hats, we have a lot of different responsibilities. And so finding the time to build the skills, practice the skills, and do the thing can be really hard sometimes. And it can feel really overwhelming. And so we want to just think a little bit about taking those baby steps. How can we break it down into small chunks and kind of apply this in small ways, and not necessarily feeling like we have to change everything? I know something that comes up with a lot of groups we work with is they're like, oh, we know our website needs to change. We know our website needs to change, but it feels like this huge undertaking. We have to train everybody. We have to figure out how to fix all this stuff. And so nothing happens because it's overwhelming. And so start with that one flyer, that one email, just really trying to find those small ways that you can build it into your work. Like Melanie's mentioned, we have a lot of kind of easy access points. We have a community of practice group that meets every other month. It's a great place to come in and ask questions to communication. We have our monthly office hours for those little checkpoints or quick things that you want help with. Yeah, and so I think it can be this is a real challenge, and I think that trying to find those small ways to address it is the first step that we can take. And like Melanie said at the very beginning, we all make mistakes. We're all learning, and so we can kind of be reflective about our work and pay attention to what's not working and make those tweaks as we go along. So like that vaccine flyer, maybe you use it as it is and people are like, oh, it's not perfect. And so then you take that and next time make some further adjustments to get closer to the goal. But it doesn't have to be perfect the first time. It's a learning process.
Mm-hmm. And eventually maybe some of this stuff just gets built in. Like I know when I worked at the adult ed program, we sort of built in that every May we were going to revisit our intake form because we knew that things changed and we didn't want to have questions on there that were irrelevant or not helpful to people, or that we had questions that people answered wrong every single time. How could we make those better this time around? So we just tried to build that into our process, that this was always something that we did, and it was just normal. Of course we're going to look at this because things change in our processes. And then the last one is kind of related, of just like, how are we measuring things and making sense of how things went? How are we checking if things are successful? You know, how are we creating feedback loops? Who do we get feedback from? I appreciated that note just now in the chat about like thinking about who are the people that are in images, and how are we making sure that they're representative of our audience, but at the same time making sure we're not falling into tropes or stereotypes. We were working with a state agency, and we were looking at some brochure examples, and one of the first things someone in our group noticed was that there was nobody in the group that had a visible disability, and that popped out at them immediately. So you know, it matters. You know, people notice those things, and they notice if they feel seen, and I think that's such a great you know, opportunity always to get feedback from all of these parts of things, and then incorporate them in for next time if we don't kind of hit the right note the first time. You know, and thinking about we're going to actually put in the let me see if I'll do that real quick. we're going to put a Jamboard in the chat. Sarah's going to throw that in. I would love if we just take 2 or 3 minutes, and this could be an ongoing thing. Maybe you add to later on if you're in the mood. But as we sort of work toward questions and wrapping up, we've got a couple questions in there thinking about the things we've talked about today, in terms of, what are things you're doing that are working that you can share with other people, whether that's internally, whether that's with community partners. If you have any examples, we would love for you to kind of throw them in there into that Jamboard. If you've never used the Jamboard tool before, it is, here, let me show you really quick, just in case anybody, I believe I have it open. Hold on 1 second. There it is. So there are 3 kind of panels that are open. If you hit the arrow on the top, it'll switch you to the 3 different questions. And they just mirror the things we talked about today. So thinking about your colleagues, your community partners, and your community members. If you have any things that you're thinking about that fit into any of these, feel free to throw in some ideas, some examples. For example, we were working with a different legal aid organization a couple years ago, and after doing some training together, they actually created kind of a little working group that worked on plain language, and they ended up creating sort of like a vocabulary like pool of words that they use a lot so people can understand, and don't have to dig for, how do I explain this, what pro se means. They just had sort of this little glossary that they'd created for people. And especially too, thinking about, you have new staff coming in all the time. What does that look like or feel like for them when they're coming and onboarding into an organization? So I would love you to throw in any suggestions. There's nothing too small. So feel free to chime in on any of these 3 areas. And if you are still thinking and you want to keep adding to this, we'll share this afterwards in that document so that you can feel free to add to it again or come back to it. I love the don't use all caps at all caps. Thank you. That's that's awesome. Yeah.
Oh,
Sarah.
just and quickly, I don't know if I don't think we covered it, but if you haven't used Jamboard before, if you look on the left, there's like the panel of tools, and you click on the little sticky note is how you add new comments. So if you're wondering where all these little colorful squares are coming from, that's how.
That's how. Yeah, so awesome. We'll keep feeling free to add into this. Emily, I think that's a great question. I don't know, Sarah, if you have any thoughts about that, I'm happy to chime in too, or does anyone else want to chime in on that? Like, I think Emily's question is fantastic of how do you get over sort of the not wanting to talk about anything that's uncomfortable or not great, like how it's great, it's awesome, it's wonderful, kind of attitude that might drown out the idea of like, well, wait, could we do it differently though? What could we do instead? Or this didn't kind of hit like we wanted it to. What could we do next time? Has anyone had any experience with that where they kind of have to like help people recognize that talking about things constructively doesn't mean bad? I'd love to hear, yeah, if anyone wants to chime in.
I'll chime in. I would say we shouldn't always frame things in a positive way. Some things aren't positive. And maybe you preface it by saying, hey, this may be hard to hear, or hey, I have to share this, or something to kind of signal or prepare someone that, you're going to have something to say that they may not want to hear. But I don't think it helps anyone to shy away from being candid and from addressing things head on. I think it does help if you come with a solution and praise what you can, but then, be candid.
Yeah.
That's such a great point that like, right, it could be doing a big disservice, and also coming with solutions. I think that's such a great point, is a lot of times it's easy to just say, well, this is, don't do this and don't do that. But if we can come to the table with ideas, that can be really
Yeah.
helpful and make people feel excited instead of like, stressed out. I think another thing is, I think one thing we like to do is tie things back to the values of the organization. So if our values are, advancing equity, or our values are creating a welcoming space, instead of making it about this is bad or good, it's saying, how can this be more helpful, more useful, more equitable, more accessible, and kind of getting away from the black and white of just like, this is all one thing or all another thing, but like, how do we kind of bring it back to say, well, this could do more with accessibility, which would be awesome, and that's part of our value. So let's like tie it to some of those type of things. Rachel has a comment. Feel free to share.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that another thing that could be practiced is having regular communication about feedback. So if it kind of comes out of the blue and it only comes out of the blue when it's something that's negative or could be perceived as negative, then that I think is a lot harder for folks to digest. So if you are in the rhythm of regularly providing feedback, then folks are going to be more open to it and going to approach it as constructive versus negative.
That's awesome. Yes. If it's like the only time they hear it is that, then they're like, ah. So I think that's such a great point, is just like, how do we normalize this and just make it part of our routine, like to talk about things that we can do in other ways, and just changing that culture of just like, and it's hard to like think, because a lot of us might feel like, I made a mistake, I don't want to dwell on it, I don't want to talk about the mistake I made, or I don't want to talk about the event that didn't go well, and how to unpack and say, okay, we're not trying to say it was not good, but how do we continue to have these conversations where we can figure out how to grow and evolve the things that we're doing to work for our community. So thank you, that's a great point, Rachel. We'll keep adding to this. I'm seeing all sorts of fantastic ideas here. Yeah, I think there's just so much we can learn from when things don't always go the way we wanted. But it's hard. Again, I get it. As I said, I was not joking about being a recovering perfectionist. It's hard. But I think that if we don't have these hard conversations, we might not get where we want to go. Misty, that's a great point of like, I think in the chat, I saw like bringing that information to the table of saying, hey, look, this document like appears to be written at a graduate level, and it is for community members that are really stressed out and English is their second language. Well, that doesn't match together. So yeah, sometimes being able to show or have that feedback, like Sarah said, from our groups has been really invaluable. Like we actually, what were we working on recently? We had something where the group responded that the text that we were looking at felt rude and felt negative. We were looking at a survey, and that was really powerful to be able to talk about with the folks that we were working with, because I felt that way, but I was like, it became even more powerful when I was able to say like, these are the comments that we got back from people, and I know that's not what you're trying to go for. So how can we get what you need from this survey, but also respect the fact that we don't want people to feel bad doing it. Rose, there are like lots of apps and things out there that do sort of readability testing. I think we always want to be mindful that we're not just relying on a number, because we can have something that's written at a certain grade level, but it doesn't actually like answer the questions that people have, or it doesn't fit the format or the design needs that we have. So I always I think they can be helpful for some people to get that gauge, but we want to make sure we're also checking with our audience and doing these other things too. But I think, share some of those in the resource list that is in the chat. So definitely, feel free to explore those. But we have, I think, a couple blog posts about that too. Okay, we did that. I know we are getting close to time. These have been fantastic questions. If there are any other questions that you want to throw in, if we have time for, we've still got a few minutes. Feel free to put those in the chat. I want to mention that we do have these events coming up this fall. We've got our community of practice coming up soon. That is a free opportunity where we come together and just talk about all things plain language. Last month we had a guest who talked about improving their program numbers in a tax program. So we talk about all sorts of stuff. We also have a webinar coming up about AI and kind of what is going on with that, if that is something that you're interested in exploring. And then we also have that new digital drop-in group, as well as a couple other things. So please feel free to check those out. We would love to connect with you and chat with you and learn with you in the future land. I really want to make sure to thank IHA for having us. Thank you, Mario, for being our behind the scenes person. Our email addresses are pretty easy to remember: melanie@litworks.org and sarah@litworks.org. Please feel free to connect with us, and yeah, we'll stick around for a minute, but otherwise, thank you so much for making space today and all the work you do. I know it's not easy, and I appreciate it so much. So thank you. Thank you.
Oh.
I have a quick question. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Are you going to share the presentation?
Yes, actually, as soon as we get off this call, I'm going to put a link in that document that
Okay,
Sarah shared. So
thank you.
within 5 minutes, it should be there. Thank you.
Okay, no worries. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a fantastic day, and thanks for
You too.
joining us.
Thanks, everyone. I'm not sure how the recording will be shared. That's a IHA question, unless Melanie, you know.
No, I don't. Maybe that's a question. I don't know if Mario can answer. Or maybe if you follow up with the email you got, maybe they can communicate that. We're guests, so I don't know how they do that. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Thanks, Sarah. And yeah, have a fantastic day. Okay, take care.